This is my talk entitled Grenzenlose Möglichkeiten, trotz der Sprachbarriere. Or is it? I didn't touch anything. So during this talk I will be discussing the limitations in communication between deaf and hearing communities in Munich, and I'll be focusing on innovation in deaf communities as a tool for communication. So what are Grenzen in the context of the German deaf community? Why is it that communication is impaired? Is it firstly a lack of linguistic overlap? Is it that deaf people do not master the spoken language and hearing people do not master sign language? Is it a geographical matter? Not that the people don't exist in the same city, but do they exist in the same spaces? Or is it a societal issue? Is there a lack of deaf awareness? Is there a lack of communication tools in place to integrate people? I'll be focusing on two different types of communication. The communication between local hearing deaf communities, so people who exist in the same space, in the same city, but who don't necessarily talk to each other, and communication between international deaf communities, so people who are not from the same place, but who share a common thread, that being their deafness. In the first case, there is very poor integration, so deaf people are often very poorly integrated into the hearing world. It's very negative for their mental health, self-esteem, productivity. Deaf people obviously find it very difficult to get jobs if no one's willing to hire them. Whereas on the other hand, international deaf communication is very good. Now we might think, why is that? Is that because sign language is easy? Is it because it's international? Is that why it's easy for people to communicate with each other? I will argue that that's not the case. What is important here is that deaf people have very particular skills that hearing people do not have, and that's what facilitates this communication. So to talk about sign languages, I'm aware that most people do not know very much about sign languages, so we've got a sort of brief overview here. They're not mutually intelligible with each other and highly dialectal, so even within the same country there are lots of different dialects used. They have their own full grammar, it's not just a signed version of the spoken language, it's a completely different language. And there are some shared linguistic features which we will go over that might explain why some sign languages are easier to understand if you already know another sign language. But effectively, the thrust of my argument is that deaf communities have skills that hearing communities do not, because they are forced to communicate in innovative ways constantly. So what is deaf community? The formation of deaf life is shaped by hearing society, so they are not born into a deaf culture, but they have to seek it out for themselves, normally centred around deaf schools and clubs. The statistic I have, which should rightfully horrify you, is that although 90% of deaf children have hearing parents, most hearing parents never learn sign language. So if the children learn sign language, the most natural native language for a deaf person, they will not be able to communicate in a native way with their parents. And so normally a culture you're born into, you share with your family. It's not the case in this situation. Integration, bilaterally stigmatized. So what that means is that deaf people often have a bias against learning the spoken language because they are mistreated by hearing people, and it also works the other way around. Hearing parents often won't learn sign language because it's stigmatized. They will discourage their children from learning sign language. And instead of the sort of idea that we have of deaf signers being bilingual, so being able to use the spoken language and the signed language, we often end up with a semi-lingual ability, or even alingual, where these people are denied a native language, essentially because they've been failed in their education. Deaf people are exposed to other languages and are very linguistically innovative in that they have to be used to language mixing. Often at school they will be working with written English but signed sign language. In the case of German it would be they learn to write German, but they sign German Sign Language, and these are not the same language. There's code switching, there's a lot of innovation, and learning to make sense from little information. Like, if you learn to lip read, you can actually get to a situation where you only have to guess about 50% of what's being said, but that's the best case scenario. So they have to be very, very good at inferring meaning, and this means that their communication style is very different. So what are some of the features of sign languages that might make it easy to transfer skills? There are many types of etymology of different signs. People have this opinion that it's all just mime, but once you get past very basic physical tasks, how are you going to mime that? So I will show you some of the etymological features here. We have mime, iconicity of shape, iconicity of movement, logical location, and then influence of the spoken language. So I've got some examples that I'm going to show you in parallel with, if it works, British Sign Language and German Sign Language, so that you can see the shared this on that side. Right, so now I can't see that. So if we go for some example words, so we have an example of mime, which, if you look here, so we have it in BSL here, British Sign Language, and German Sign Language here. So if we think about the idea of linguistic economy, it's the idea that people do not use more effort than is required to get meaning across. There is no more logical a way to convey the idea of tennis in a visual language than visually representing tennis. This is mime, but it is also the sign for tennis. There is no reason that this would not be the sign for tennis. Why make it more complex than it needs to be? But that's only one aspect of sign language etymology. We also have so table, tish, we can see here that we've got the iconicity of shape. So we're not using the physical movement, we're using the shape of the object. And that's the etymology of the sign. Again, it's a sort of onomatopoeia. You know, you're making your language more like the thing you are trying to explain. Again, very logical. And it would be more logical to not use this really in the language. So here we have bicycle, Fahrrad. Here we've got not describing the shape of the object, but describing what the human does with it. So this is sort of the movement of the feet on the bicycle that explains the object. These are all features that sign languages have in common, that once you know them in one language, it's quite easy to transfer. So here we have an interesting feature, which is a logical location of the sign. So on the left-hand side we have the BSL, understand, and it's focused in this area here, which represents the brain. So just sort of here with your dominant hand. And we have the same thing in German with verstehen, but the difference that we have is that because there is the fair at the start of the word, we have this V hand shape, which we'll see again in a minute. So the etymology of it is not only brain location, something to do with thinking or the brain, but also fair, so you've got the link with the spoken language. We'll see this in another example. So here on the left hand we've got publish in BSL, obviously linked to print. It's the logical visual representation of how you might print. Whereas in the German, we've got this really interesting example of borrowed etymology from the German word. So the sign to open, öffnen, is this. It's this shape of opening, very logical. But here you can see that veröffentlichen is the prefix fair with the idea of öffnen, so V, open. That's the etymology of that word, meaning to publish. And So you can see it's very heavily related to the spoken language, but that doesn't mean that the sign is the spoken language. It's just a logical response to being surrounded by spoken German. Of course it's going to affect your language. It does in any situation where there are many languages colliding. It always interacts. So I thought this was an interesting example of that. And we have another example here. So where am I? So if you look carefully at this, kaufen. So what we're doing there in the lip pattern is kauf. So we have the sign combined with kauf. Whereas if we look at the sign for Strafe, which is here, so you'll see that the sign is the exact same, and these are examples of what's called minimal pairs. So that's a linguistic term for when two words or two terms differ in only one small, minute, distinct way. In this case, the distinction is the lip pattern. So we can see that the spoken language is really integrated into the sign language because these aspects of the spoken language are the only things that differentiate these words. So the only way you know if they were saying Strafe or kaufen is by the lip pattern. Okay, so that's sort of the list of things that we've talked about here. The spoken language does influence the sign language, but that doesn't mean that the sign language is just a bad rendering of the spoken language. So let's go over to the case study of Munich. I was in a typical sign language class. It was 1 hour. It was a deaf teacher making all of the effort for communication, a room full of hearing people. All native Germans, everyone was native to Munich, including the teacher. And what was really interesting to watch was how difficult the communication was between these people who all live in the same city. It was very, very forced and artificial and just very difficult. And all of the effort was being made by the teacher. Now, I was there as the only foreigner, and because I had deaf awareness skills and spoke a different sign language, actually, I was the only one that could communicate effectively with both groups of people, which put me in a very strange situation. If we compare this with the second situation here at the local deaf Stammtisch, so the sort of local social, there were people from many different countries, all degrees of hearing, all had some experience with signing, but not necessarily with German signing. And the people who were deaf or deafened had experience with lip reading or facilitating communication with people who they didn't necessarily share a language with. And here, we talked all night. It was amazing. The communication was so easy, even though we did not necessarily share a language. Now, why would this be? In the first situation, we're relying on the hearing community where deaf awareness is basically zero. So we're relying on them to facilitate communication, and it's not happening, so it has to all be from the deaf side. Whereas in the second situation, it's just deaf people altogether who already have this deaf awareness and who are already used to having to be innovative, trying different things. They're used to what features people might try to use to communicate, and the conversation just worked. So what I would say would be my conclusion is that there are still a lot of barriers to communication, and the hearing society that we live in makes all of the effort one-sided. Hearing people do not normally have any signing skills, any deaf awareness, and this isolates and alienates deaf communities.